We will be looking at examples of some of the key resources that have been provided as a part of the learning management systems for the courses developed for agroprocessing and business management. We'll be using 3 courses to demonstrate some of these, or to show some of these different resources that have been provided. We'll be using Introduction to Food Processing, we'll be using Introduction to Food Engineering, and we'll be using Food and Sustainable Agriculture as course examples to demonstrate some of the resources that have been provided and some of the recommended approaches of how these particular educational resourcing or teaching resources can be used in the remote and virtual learning environment. So we'll first start with introductory activities. At the beginning of each and every lesson offered under this particular project, there will be an introductory activity. The introductory activity is essentially a very short and concise activity or component of preceding lessons to come that allows the student to get some preliminary insight into the assignments, into the content that is going to be developed or delivered throughout the week. So at the beginning of each week, students can on their own review these introductory activities, which will be a combination of forums. It can also be, in some cases, a very small experiment. It can be a basic activity that they can do at home, and oftentimes these activities do not require any excessive types of resources or materials in order to complete them. So let's use lesson 1 in Introduction to Food Processing as an example of an introductory activity. This particular introductory activity, which is a part of the Unit 1 Introduction to Food Processing, is called From Mangoes to Mango Chutney. And here the students have to think about what processing they think happens to mangoes in order to get mango chutney. And they would be required to essentially list, in this case in a discussion forum, so they can list the different types of ingredients that they think are in the mango chutney, how these ingredients had to be processed or handled before they could be used to make the chutney, and then they will essentially create through that discussion forum a kind of workflow or a flow chart. It won't be an actual chart, but through the discussion, a kind of step-by-step process of how mangoes are processed to give mango chutney. And this essentially, again, requires no additional activities, no additional supplies or materials. It's really just a connection to their everyday consumption of foods, to think about how these foods are processed in order to get to these final innovative food products that we buy and use every day on the shelf. So this is an example of an introductory activity that is provided in this particular course. But as mentioned, these introductory activities are provided at the beginning of every week. They are meant to be student-led. In other words, students do not need the direct guidance of faculty to complete the particular activity. It is really a very simple, straightforward activity that shouldn't take anywhere more than 15 to 30 minutes to complete. So that is an example. Here's another example in lesson 2. As mentioned, all lessons have introductory activities. They need to find a healthy processed food at home. And then they're going to look at the ingredients and make note of those ingredients that they think are healthy ingredients. So they can be looking at vitamins, they can be looking at minerals, they can be looking at lightly processed foods such as wheat-based foods, etc. And then they need to discuss what benefits they think their food that they got at home and the ingredients of those food at home would contribute to the nutritional value of that particular product. So that now introduces them to this particular lesson, which focuses on nutrition and the maintenance of nutrition in food quality when it comes to the processing of food. So these are just two examples, but as mentioned before, all lessons have specific examples or for specific introductory activities that introduces them to the concepts that are to be taught throughout the duration of the course. We will now look at PowerPoint. So the vast majority of lessons will include at least one PowerPoint. In some cases, it may include two PowerPoints, depending on how much detail might be provided. There might also be three, but very less likely that you'll find three. But at a minimum, you will find one in most cases. In some cases, you might find two. And these PowerPoints are provided here in PowerPoint format. So if faculty, for whatever reason, would like to adapt some of the content, they would be free to do that because we provided it in an editable format for you. So here is an example from lesson 1 again, Introduction to Food Processing. When you click on that, it will be downloaded to your device, and then that PowerPoint will be available to you for you to review, make edits if necessary, and re-upload. Or if not, it will be available to your students, of course, for them to go through as you are teaching, or for them to have already on file so that they can do their own studies, they can make their own notes, etc. So as mentioned before, in this case, lesson 1 has two PowerPoints. Right throughout, you generally have PowerPoint presentations that are provided throughout the lesson, or throughout the course rather. We will then look at what we're calling documents. Now, documents are typically provided in PDF format. These are additional reading resources that either are specifically related to the core content that is being provided, or are provided as additional reading material to supplement the content that has been provided in that particular lesson. So let's look at an example of a document that has been provided in this particular course. We will scroll all the way down to lesson 9, and lesson 9 is lesson 10. And lesson 10 is on food contaminants. And one of the resources that we're providing here as a document is Jamaican curry powder recall. So when that is clicked on, the document will open. And in this case, you can see it is a circular from the state of Connecticut that was issued advising relevant personnel that in August 18, 2016, 5 brands of curry powder and these are Jamaican-based curry powders, were recalled due to concerns of safety of the particular items. And this is the actual circular that's available, and this is a very useful resource. So students, number one, can have some understanding on the importance of ensuring that foods are free of contaminants once they get into market. It also helps students to analyze the implications in terms of international trade when foods are not compliant when it comes to safety. And it also allows the students to do an evaluation as well. So you can provide this particular resource and students can evaluate what they believe could have contributed to this particular issue. In this case, there was concerns about the amount of lead. So here it says that the curry powders are contaminated with lead and no amount of lead is safe to ingest. Therefore, all products should cease immediately. So they could do a HACCP analysis, for example, to determine where do they possibly think the lead contamination could have occurred through the processing of curry. And this is a very useful and real life example or case study that could help to reiterate the importance of food contamination in the safety and sustainability of food supply. These kinds of resources are provided throughout the different courses in different ways. In some cases, they might be provided as additional reading material. In some cases, they are provided as core pieces of material. So here's another example from week 12, where we look at nutritional facts label, and this essentially is an infographic that speaks about the different components of how nutritional labels are to be developed and provided according to the FDA. So these again are very useful real life applications of content that they are theories that they would have been learning, for example, in a PowerPoint or through the general virtual discussions that you are having with your students. These particular documents help to provide more specific applications of that information. We also provide, as mentioned before, infographics, such as the one we actually just looked at. These are more pictorial representations of content. They help to break up heavily worded documents such as PowerPoints or PDFs, etc., to provide something that's a little bit more palatable for students. Again, these infographics tend to be very can be used in a more self-led or student-led learning activities. So you can assign it to students for them to review and for them to give their understanding of the information that they have gotten. So I'm going to provide another example in lesson 2. So in lesson 2, here is an infographic on new food product development. And what this particular infographic does is actually show you the 8 steps to developing new products or new food products or new food technologies. So it goes through step 1, idea generation, step 2, idea screening, etc. So students can, on their own, can review this, can do their own research, can do their own analysis, and then you can allow them to apply this particular structure to some kind of new food item or food innovation, to see if they understand how to apply this particular set of notes. We also provide websites throughout the courses, relevant websites to the particular areas. These websites tend to again have specific cases, information that is more application in nature, information that is oftentimes highly has significant local, regional, or international implications. So for example, let's go back to lesson 1, and in lesson 1, here is a website that speaks to the strategies to improve agriculture in financial year 2021. It is an article from the Gleaner. If the students click on strategies to improve agriculture in financial year 2021 and they click on the article, they will see some general policies that were set late last year on how can agriculture position itself considering the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this gives a kind of overarching high-level strategic discussions about how Jamaica's food industry can adapt and pivot in this space in the face of COVID-19. So again, a very specific analytical case study, so for students to review and to analyze. Because there's quite a bit of existing information that exists on YouTube, we wanted to scope the information that exists on the platform and provide those key pieces of video content in the public domain that we believe could be relevant to a particular lesson. So let's look at a YouTube example in lesson 5. Lesson 5's topic is chemical preservatives and food safety. And here we are looking at how to set the shelf life of food. Now, this is a very interesting video that speaks largely to the kind of mathematical equations and graphs that are used to help to set the shelf life of foods. And when the student clicks on it, it can play directly in the learning management system. They can put it on full screen if they wish, and you can give them this particular activity for them to review and to give their feedback and to apply to any specific examples that you're providing in your particular class. Several YouTube videos are used throughout the courses and will be very relevant for the students, and will also be a very interesting way for the students to learn as well. We made significant efforts in trying to engage experts in the field outside of your institutions to invite them into the classrooms, and these are provided in the form of guest lectures. These providers of information or lectures come from many different areas within the food industry and are provided and scattered throughout the different courses. So these are very useful in giving Jamaican voices to the educational experience for students. As we know, there's lots of information on YouTube, but it's very useful for students to hear their own Jamaican voices and their own Jamaican faces, so that they can also be inspired to, that they too can make a significant contribution to the food industry. So let's take, for example, Food and Sustainable Agriculture, Lecture 7. And Lecture 7 speaks on climate-smart agro-production systems. And a guest lecture was given by Mrs. Faradine Forbes Edwards from the Environmental Health Foundation. And again, the video is right there. The students can watch this lecture. It gives very specific industry-related examples, real world examples for students to review and to give to apply to their studies as they progress. And there are several of these throughout the courses that can be utilized if in the event that faculty members may not be able to invite faculty themselves to come in and present to their classes. These are available resources for you. We have also invited experts to give what we call podcasts or interviews. So these are more audio-based lessons that students can listen to that speaks to the specific areas in a given module or in a given lesson. So let us take, for example, back to Introduction to Food Processing. We will look at lesson 15, which is the last lesson, and that looks at the legal and ethical issues in food processing. And more specifically, genetically modified food or living modified organisms was a particular content piece that was important for students to understand its role in the development of innovative food products and innovative food processing techniques. So we had in this particular case Dr. Suzanne Davis from the Institute of Jamaica Clearinghouse, and they are responsible for biosafety policies that govern genetically modified foods in the country. And here the students, essentially it's a video, but it's a video of an audio recording, or more technically an audiogram. And again, this is student-led. Students can be assigned this for them to listen to, for them to take notes, and for them to apply in the relevant area. Again, they're free to put this on full screen if that's easier for them, or they can have it play and just listen to it while they're taking their notes. And again, it's a very useful way to get experts from industry into the classroom to share those industry-related information. Now we will go and have a specific discussion on practical activities. So one of the areas that is particularly a challenge for those courses that include practical components, such as Introduction to Food Processing, where it is partly theoretical and partly practical, is how do you get practical activities? How do you make practical activities accessible to students? How do we ensure that we are giving them the necessary learning resources and experiences to build their practical skills in these particular areas? What we have done is that we have, first of all, ensured that we have for each relevant lesson, we have provided lab manuals or practical manuals. So if an experiment is required or useful in that particular lesson, then we provide a lab manual. And this allows both the faculty members to essentially have a thorough review of the particular activity. And then it also gives the students the tools that they will need to do the practical activities if they're doing it in a more hybrid type environment, or if in some cases they're doing it remotely at home. We have done our best where possible to design select practical activities in such a way that some of them can be done at home or can be done on campus, but with minimal supervision. In other words, not too many harmful tools, not too many harmful materials, so that they can do this on their own. They can do this in a live virtual environment. But again, this is for some of the practicals, because the truth is there are some practicals that simply require access to certain kinds of equipment, certain kinds of supplies, certain kinds of reagents, and there's really no working around it. So what we've done is that we have provided lab manuals as mentioned. So for example, in lesson 3 for Introduction to Food Processing, this particular lesson is on natural additives. We looked at color preservation in foods. So this particular lab looked at the use of different acids in preserving the color, in this case we would call food quality of food. So here the lab manual is written up in the scientifically technical way, looking at the objectives, the background, the materials required. As you can see, we've also kind of made note of those particular supplies that you could use if you're doing this particular experiment at home. So if you don't have petri dishes, for example, you can instead use bowls. If you don't have citric acid, you can use vinegar. If you don't have citric or ascorbic acid, you can use lime or lemons, etc. So it's also, if this has to be done at home, it gives the students some of those resources that can be used to substitute for things you would typically find in a lab. Then you have the methodology, then the results tables, and of course you will then have to indicate to the students that they need to describe the results, but at least you have some standardized way for students to present their findings in the general scientific approach to experiments. And then some questions or discussion points on how they can analyze their findings in writing up their discussion. So lab manuals are provided, or experiment manuals are provided where relevant in the specific courses. Now, in some cases, we have also gone ahead and done the labs and recorded it. So there are a handful of labs that will be provided, video recorded labs that have been provided. These are again in video format. So that very same lab we just looked at, there's also a video lab for it. So students can also look at what their lab setup should look like if they are doing that exact lab. So you will see we go through all the different materials that are going to be required throughout. We actually do the actual experiment so students can see the actual practical activities and approaches to this particular kind of experiment. And there are, again, this isn't provided for all the labs, but it is provided in some labs to help to at least give students the exposure to the practical or the lab activities that would be required. And again, in some cases, we actually provide the results so that if a student is not able to actually do the lab, here are the results. They can give their feedback and they can analyze the results based on these results that have been provided in video. In some cases, we will provide YouTube videos that might either be experiments or may be virtual tours or field tours that allow students to get some amount of practical exposure as well. So if we go to lesson 7 as an example, with thermal processing and food safety, the milking and pasteurization process includes to a large extent thermal processing. And we provided a link to a YouTube video. In some cases, We have done the actual tours and have provided a video of those tours for students to see in a local environment that will essentially substitute what their field trip would be. So in some cases, we've also provided that as well. So here is an example from a factory, a milk factory, and it takes them through the entire pasteurization process and the role of thermal processing in that process. And then finally, we will look at evaluation activities. At the end of each lesson, there are evaluation activities. These evaluation activities can be quizzes, they can be forums, and they can be worksheets. So let's look at quizzes, for example. So let's scroll down to lesson 9. We have, and this lesson is on thermal methods part 2. And here is a quiz that is provided for the students to do. So here we go. This is a quiz. There's an existing rubric, meaning that the answers are already embedded. So when students do the quizzes, they will automatically get graded through these particular multiple choice experiments, multiple choice activities. So these are fairly straightforward. In the next video, you will see how you could adjust these if you have additional questions that you wish to ask, etc. Then we have forums. Let's look at an example of a forum in lesson 11. Lesson 11 looks at HACCP, and this particular evaluation activity essentially asks some questions that students can, through the forum, discuss. Okay, so here is an example of how cane is processed to give sugar. And students are going to be required to use HACCP to propose where in this process there are likely points of the introduction of contaminants, and what could those critical control points be throughout that process to ensure that you can manage and monitor the potential for contaminations through this process. And that allows some amount of peer-to-peer crowdsourcing ideation through this particular evaluation activity, and it has to be directly, and it will be directly linked to the content that is provided in the lesson proceeding. And then as a last example, we have worksheets. Let's look at Introduction to Food Engineering. And worksheets are essentially Word documents that students can go into, and they can put in their ideas or their answers, and then they can submit that back to you. So here is an example from lesson 3, which looks at fluid flow in food processing. We will click on the evaluation activity. The evaluation activity will be downloaded for the students. And then when the students download those, they can then input their information, their name, their email, their ID number, and then they can answer the questions. Here, they can save it as a PDF and they can resubmit it to faculty for review. As faculty, you can also adjust this evaluation activity. So if you only want to ask one question, or if you want to add additional questions, you can certainly do that directly on this, re-upload it back to your classroom, and then allow students to assess that. These are the main activities and resources that have been provided and or recommended approaches of how you can use these in the virtual learning environment. If you have any recommendations whatsoever with regards to this, feel free to contact the council through your institutions, and we hope that these resources will provide some value and will also allow you to be far more efficient and far more effective as you adapt to this new learning environment in both the virtual and the dual modalities in your classroom. Best of luck. Thank you for listening.